A 9-year-old girl is called into court in the middle of her parents' legal battle over her custody. But when she reveals a secret they should never have heard, everything changes in ways no one expected. The courtroom was filled with a heavy silence, broken only by the occasional murmur of lawyers adjusting papers and the judge's firm voice organizing the proceedings. Clara, a 9-year-old girl, sat on a bench next to her lawyer, her feet dangling just above the floor. Her face was expressionless, though her eyes scanned every corner of the room with curiosity. At her young age, she was caught up in a battle she didn't even fully understand. Across the room, Helena and Ricardo, her parents, occupied opposite positions, like soldiers on opposing sides of an emotional war. Helena, with her hair carefully tied back in a dress that exuded professionalism, held a small notebook in which she had jotted down important points. Her expression was tense, but she tried to maintain a measured smile, as if that would convince the judge of her suitability. Ricardo, on the other hand, wore a dark suit that was a bit tight on him, with a stiff posture and a gaze that went from the judge to Helena, avoiding Clara almost completely. His fingers drummed nervously on the table, although he tried to project confidence as he consulted with his lawyer. The atmosphere was tense. The judge began the session by reviewing the opening arguments of both sides, each word resonating in the air as a reminder of what was at stake: Clara's future. Clara watched in silence as her parents talked about her as if she weren't there, each trying to highlight her qualities as a parent and downplay the other's faults. Helena mentioned her dedication as a mother, highlighting sleepless nights and her effort to ensure Clara never lacked anything. Ricardo, on the other hand, highlighted the bond he had cultivated with his daughter, highlighting weekends together in the park and conversations about their childhood dreams. The little girl, without saying a word, began to feel the weight of the glances that were occasionally cast upon her. It was strange to hear her parents describe her as a kind of trophy that they both wished to win. The words stability, well-being, and future floated around the room, but none of them resonated with what Clara truly felt. As the arguments on both sides played out, the court seemed to split between those who sympathized with Helena and those who felt that Richard should be given a fair chance. Clara, however, remained at the center of this battle, feeling that no one was asking her how she really felt. The clock ticked away, but for Clara, every minute was getting longer. She glanced at her parents, wondering why they couldn't sit together like they used to at family dinners. Her lawyer whispered a few words in her ear, reminding her that it would soon be her turn to speak, translated from Spanish to English. www.onlinedoctranslator.com. Clara nodded, though her mind wandered to memories of happier days. Outside, the noise of the city continued its indifferent course, while inside the courtroom, the first act of a story that would change the lives of all present was unfolding. The murmur in the courtroom died down as Clara was called to the stand. All eyes fell on her, a small figure in contrast to the imposing formality of the courtroom. Her lawyer escorted her to the seat reserved for witnesses, whispering words of encouragement before retreating. Clara stepped up carefully, her feet barely touching the floor, and took the microphone in small but firm hands. "Good morning, Clara," said the judge in a warmer tone than he had used until then. "I want you to know that you are here to tell us your perspective. Take your time and tell us what you think is important." The girl nodded, took a deep breath, and began to speak in a voice that, though soft, filled the room with its clarity. "My house with Mom is very tidy," he said, looking first at Helena. "She always has a schedule for everything: when to eat, when to study, when to sleep. She helps me a lot with school, and sometimes she lets me sleep in her bed when I'm scared." A slight smile crossed Helena's face, but it quickly disappeared when Clara continued. "Although, sometimes Mom gets angry if I leave things lying around or forget something. She yells at me, but then she apologizes." Clara's words fell like small stones in water, creating ripples of discomfort in the room. Helena clasped her hands together, her knuckles white from the pressure. Then Clara turned her gaze towards Ricardo, who was watching her with a mixture of nervousness and tenderness. "With Dad, things are different. He always lets me choose what I want to do, and we play together a lot. I like it when he tells me stories before bed." But Clara paused, biting her lower lip. Ricardo's lawyer straightened his posture, anticipating what was to come. But sometimes Dad forgets to cook for me when he's busy, and I feel lonely at his house, because it's not as noisy as at Mom's. The statement caused a slight stir among those present. The lawyers took notes feverishly, while Clara's parents exchanged tense glances. For the first time, Clara noticed Ricardo's expression harden, as if her words had hit him full force. Helena's lawyer stood up to ask questions. "Clara, what do you prefer to do in your free time?" Clara tilted her head, thinking, "I like to draw. I draw pictures of my family when we were together." The room fell silent. The answer seemed simple, but it carried a nostalgia that the adults couldn't ignore. Ricardo's lawyer approached. "Clara, you said that sometimes you feel lonely with your dad. Could you explain to us how that makes you feel?" Clara looked down at her hands, fiddling with the hem of her skirt. "It's like something's missing, but I know that Dad loves me very much." With each answer, Clara demonstrated a maturity that disarmed the lawyer's attempts to manipulate her narrative. Her words did not favor either parent entirely, but rather painted a true picture of what her life was like, split between two homes. When she finished her statement, the judge thanked her in a solemn tone. Clara stepped down from the podium and returned to her seat, feeling a new weight on her chest. She had spoken sincerely, but she couldn't ignore the worried glances of her parents. For the first time, she understood that her words had the power to change something much bigger than herself. The atmosphere in the courtroom had become thicker after Clara's first statement. Her words had struck a chord, but what came next left everyone breathless. Clara was called back to the stand to expand on her remarks. This time, her gaze reflected a mix of determination and vulnerability, as if she were about to release something she had carried for too long. The judge, in the same warm tone as before, encouraged her. "Clara, if there is anything else you would like to share, now is the time." The girl took a deep breath. For a moment, she looked at her parents, who were watching her with expectation and some fear. Then she spoke. "Once when I was younger, I heard Mom and Dad fighting in the kitchen. It was late, I wasn't supposed to be awake, but I couldn't sleep because they were yelling." Helena and Ricardo exchanged quick glances, their expressions hardening. Clara continued. "Mom told Dad that she couldn't trust him because he was always thinking more about his job than about us. And Dad told her that Mom never listened to him, that everything always had to be his way." The room fell into a deathly silence. Helena pressed her lips together, and Ricardo looked at the floor, avoiding the lawyer's inquisitive gaze. Clara, oblivious to the tension her words were generating, continued speaking with the same childish sincerity. "I remember that Mom cried a lot that night. Dad tried to hug her, but she didn't let him. I thought maybe they could make up, but the next day Dad left early and didn't come back until very late." Helena's lawyer stood up, trying to soften the impact of the revelation. "Clara, did that happen a long time ago?" The girl nodded. "Yes, I think it was before Dad moved." Ricardo's lawyer, sensing the opportunity, intervened. "Clara, how did you feel that night?" The girl hesitated, her eyes lowering to the ground before answering. "Sad. I wanted them to stop fighting." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with pent-up emotions. Clara's statement had not only exposed a private moment between her parents, but had also provided a glimpse into the root of the conflict that had brought them to this point. Helena leaned towards her lawyer, whispering something under her breath, while Ricardo leaned back in his chair, as if he had received an unexpected blow. The judge intervened, trying to restore some calm to the room. "Thank you, Clara. You have been very brave to share this with us. You may return to your seat." Clara slowly descended from the podium, feeling like she had let go of a weight she had carried with her for years. But as she returned to her seat, she noticed her parents' tense expressions, and a pang of guilt crossed her chest. Helena and Ricardo avoided looking at each other directly, but the awkwardness between them was evident. Clara's words could not be denied or ignored. They had come out into the open, revealing that their problems were not just legal or logistical, but deeply emotional and human. As the judge announced a recess, Clara stared at her parents. In her mind, she was returning to that night in the kitchen, wishing that somehow things could be different. Clara remained silent as the courtroom slowly emptied during the recess. The echo of her own words still resonated in her mind, each sentence carrying a weight she didn't know how to handle. From her seat, she glanced sideways at her parents, each one absorbed in his own bubble of thoughts. Helena was talking quietly with her lawyer, while Ricardo was distractedly looking out the window, drumming his fingers on the table. The girl hugged her knees, a habit she had had since she was little when she felt overwhelmed. She had told the truth, as she had been told to do, but now she wondered if she had done the right thing. Her words seemed to have hurt her parents, and although no one had said it to her directly, Clara could feel the change in the air. For a moment, she remembered the last time the three of them were together. It was her birthday, before everything started to fall apart. Helena had decorated the house with balloons, and Ricardo had baked a cake that ended up being a delicious mess. Back then, laughter filled the room, and the idea of separation seemed as far away as a bad dream. But now everything was different. Clara felt like she was caught in a conflict where there were no winners, only broken hearts. Her lawyer approached with a calm smile, trying to reassure her. "You're doing very well, Clara," he said quietly. "It's important that everyone knows how you feel." Clara nodded, although inside the lawyer's words did not ease her anguish. "How can I explain what I feel if I don't even understand it myself?" she thought. She had spoken sincerely because she didn't know how to do it any other way, but that didn't make the weight of her words any easier to bear. When the break was over and everyone returned to their seats, the tension in the room was palpable. The lawyers resumed their strategies, each trying to tip the scales in favor of their client. But Clara was barely listening. Her mind was occupied with an internal struggle she couldn't ignore. Was I wrong in telling them what I heard? Are they going to get even angrier at each other because of me? These questions were running through her head as her gaze alternated between Helena and Ricardo. She wanted to get closer to them, but the abyss that seemed to separate them stopped her. The judge paused the proceedings to address Clara directly. "Clara, you have been very brave in sharing your thoughts with us. I want you to know that this court is here to help you." The girl nodded, but didn't say anything. Inside, she wished there was another way, one where no one had to get hurt. She looked at Helena and then at Ricardo, hoping to find in their eyes something that would reassure her that everything would be okay. But all she saw was the same confusion and sadness she felt. When the day's session was over, Clara left the courtroom with her parents following at an uncomfortable distance. Neither of them came closer, perhaps for fear of saying something that would complicate matters further. Clara walked slowly, feeling that although the day was over, the conflict was far from resolved. That night before going to sleep, Clara picked up a pencil and began to draw. On the paper, she sketched three figures: a woman, a man, and a little girl. They stood together, holding hands under a blue sky. As she added details, she felt tears running down her cheeks. "I wanted this to be real. More than anything, I wanted them to be a family again, somehow." The next day of the trial began with even more tension than the previous one. Clara sat between her lawyer and a social worker, while her parents settled in at their respective tables. Helena seemed more rigid than ever, and Ricardo avoided looking directly at her. Although they tried to project a facade of control, the storm that Clara had unleashed with her words was still simmering. The judge opened the session by reviewing the progress of the case, but it was clear that the emotional atmosphere was about to boil over. And so it did when Helena, visibly frustrated, interrupted Ricardo's lawyer while he was speaking. "That's not true," he exclaimed, rising from his seat. "I've always put Clara first. You have no idea what I've had to sacrifice." Ricardo stood up almost at the same time, his fists clenched and his expression indignant. "Do you really want to talk about sacrifices, Helena?" he replied in a biting tone. "Because from where I see it, you have always wanted everything to be done your way, regardless of what Clara really needs." The judge slammed his gavel on the table, trying to regain control. "Gentlemen, this is a court, not a battlefield. I remind you that we are here to protect your daughter's interests, not to fuel personal resentments." But the judge's words seemed to fall on deaf ears. Helena and Ricardo, unable to contain themselves, continued to exchange accusations, as if all the years of pent-up tension had finally found an outlet. "You're always trying to be the fun dad, but you never bothered with the serious stuff," Helena cried, her eyes shining with tears. "And you," Ricardo replied, pointing at her with his finger. You never gave me the chance to be part of those serious things. You decided everything for me, for both of us, as if I didn't exist." As the court watched in awkward silence, Clara buried her head in her hands, wishing she was anywhere else. Her heart pounded, every word her parents said echoing painfully in her mind. The judge raised his voice, finally managing to stop the argument. "Enough! Gentlemen, if you cannot behave like responsible adults, this court will be forced to make a decision without your direct participation. Is that what you want?" The judge's words seemed to sink in. Helena and Ricardo sat back down, embarrassed, but still with their faces flushed with anger. Clara looked up at them, her eyes filled with tears. "Why do you have to fight all the time?" he whispered, although loud enough for everyone to hear. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. No one dared to speak, not even the judge. Clara's words were simple, but they carried with them a painful truth that everyone had been ignoring. Helena and Ricardo exchanged fleeting glances, and for a moment, something seemed to change. Anger gave way to guilt, and they both lowered their heads, unable to meet their daughter's gaze. The judge, in a softer voice this time, addressed the parents. "I think we've all seen today the impact this dispute is having on Clara. I suggest you think deeply about your priorities. This trial is not an opportunity to win, but to ensure that she can grow up in an environment of love and stability." Helena and Ricardo nodded, still silent. Clara, although she still felt trapped in the middle of the storm, perceived for the first time a glimmer of change. That night, as they returned to their respective homes, both parents could not stop thinking about Clara's words. Something inside them was beginning to question whether the battle they were fighting really made sense. The courtroom was calmer when Clara was called back to the stand. This time, she seemed less intimidated by the formality of the place, but there was an air of sadness on her face that hadn't been there before. As she walked to her spot, she felt the stares of her parents, who now seemed more aware of the emotional burden their daughter was carrying. The judge looked at her kindly. "Clara, we know this isn't easy for you, but your words are important. We want to understand how you felt throughout this process." Clara nodded and, after a few seconds of silence, began to speak. "When Mom and Dad split up, I thought at first it was temporary. I thought that after a few days or weeks we would be together again. But then I realized that wasn't going to happen." He paused, his voice shaking slightly, but he continued with determination. "The worst thing wasn't that they no longer lived together. The worst thing was feeling like I had to choose between them." Helena lowered her head, unable to meet her daughter's gaze, while Ricardo shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "With Mom, I feel safe because everything is organized, but I also feel a little pressured because she always wants me to do everything perfectly. With Dad, I have more fun, but sometimes I feel like he is too busy and doesn't always have time for me." Clara swallowed, trying to keep control over her emotions. "I miss when we were a family. I miss waking up on Sundays with the two of them at home. Now I feel like I don't fully belong anywhere." Clara's words resonated deeply in the courtroom. The lawyers stopped taking notes, and even the judge seemed to be pondering what he had just heard. Helena's lawyer intervened in a softer tone than usual. "Clara, what do you think would make you feel happier?" Clara stared at him, as if she were searching for the answer within herself. Finally, she spoke. "I want Mom and Dad to stop fighting. I don't want to have to choose. I just want to feel like they're both there for me, together or apart." Ricardo's lawyer, moved by the girl's sincerity, asked one more question. "Clara, how do you feel every time you have to move house?" The girl sighed deeply. "It's like packing a backpack all the time. I have to remember what things to take, because if I forget something, I get sad. Sometimes I feel like I don't have a place that's completely mine." His words left a visible impact on his parents. Helena put a hand to her face, trying to hold back her tears, while Ricardo closed his eyes briefly, as if he was processing the pain he had just heard. The judge broke the silence with a firm but understanding voice. "Clara, thank you for sharing your feelings so bravely. You've given us a lot to think about. You may return to your seat." Clara descended from the stage with slow steps, her heart a little lighter, but still burdened with the uncertainty of what would come next. From her spot, she looked at her parents, hoping they had heard beyond her words, that they understood how much she wanted to feel at peace. Helena and Ricardo, for their part, remained silent, each lost in their own thoughts. For the first time, they began to understand the impact their actions were having on their daughter's life. When the session ended that day, the mood in the room was different. There was less tension and more reflection. Clara's words had touched not only her parents, but also everyone present, reminding them of what was really at stake: the emotional well-being of a little girl who just wanted to feel loved and complete. The drive home after the session was silent for Helena and Ricardo. Each of them, in their respective cars, carried Clara's words echoing in their minds. The intensity of their emotions competed with the guilt they were both beginning to recognize. For the first time in a long time, their thoughts were not about winning, but about what this battle really meant to Clara. Helena sat on the couch in her apartment that night, a cup of tea in her hands. She stared at an old photo of the three of them. Clara, barely 4 years old, sat on Ricardo's lap, while Helena put her arms around them. It was a scene of pure happiness, with no trace of the bitterness that now defined them. At what point did we stop being that, she wondered. Clara's words about feeling like she didn't have a home resonated with her. She had tried to build a perfect environment for her daughter, but in her eagerness to protect her, she hadn't considered what Clara really needed: peace, stability, and a genuine connection with both parents. Meanwhile, in his small apartment, Ricardo sat at the dining room table with his head in his hands. Clara's line about packing a backpack all the time kept running through his mind. He recalled the times he had forgotten to buy something essential for her or had been late to pick her up because of work meetings. He thought about how his relationship with Clara seemed to revolve more around superficial, happy moments, rather than the deep connection she craved. The truth was undeniable. In his eagerness to prove himself a good father, he had stopped listening to his daughter. That night, they both delved into memories and the decisions that had brought them to this point. Although they still felt resentment towards each other, the guilt began to make room for something different: a need to change. The next morning, Ricardo picked up the phone. He hesitated for a few seconds, but finally dialed Helena's number. When she answered, her tone was cautious, as if she anticipated another argument. "We need to talk," Ricardo said bluntly. Helena exhaled slowly, surprised by the lack of confrontation in his voice. "I agree," he replied after a moment. They met at a coffee shop near the courthouse, a neutral place neither of them frequented. There was awkwardness in the air as they sat down, but this time there were no lawyers or arguments, just two people trying to make sense of the harm they had caused. "Clara's right," said Ricardo, breaking the silence. "We have focused so much on winning that we have forgotten how she is experiencing it." Helena nodded, staring into her coffee cup. I always thought that what I was doing was the best for her, but I can't keep ignoring what she's telling us. She deserves more than this." For the first time in years, Helena and Ricardo stopped blaming each other and began to look inward. They talked about the moments Clara had described in court, about their own insecurities, and about how their personal wounds had overshadowed their daughter's needs. "I don't know if we can fix everything," Ricardo said after a long pause, "but I think we have to try something different. For Clara." Helena looked him straight in the eyes, seeing in him something she had forgotten: the person who once shared her life and who, despite everything, was still the father of her daughter. "Yes," he replied. "For Clara." They both knew this wouldn't solve everything right away, but simply listening to each other was a first step. That conversation marked a subtle but significant shift in how they began to approach the situation. Not as enemies, but as two parents who shared a love for their daughter. When Clara was called to the stand again, the courtroom was quieter than in previous days. The usual murmurs between lawyers and assistants were minimal, and everyone's attention was focused on the girl who, despite her young age, had been the clearest and most honest voice in the entire process. The judge leaned forward slightly, speaking with the same warmth he had used before. "Clara, we have heard a lot about what your parents think and feel. Now we want to hear more from you. Is there anything else you would like to share with us?" Clara looked at the judge, then at her mother and father, who were sitting on either side of the courtroom. She took a deep breath, gripping the microphone with small but firm hands. "Yes," she said, her voice shaking at first but gaining strength as she spoke. "I want Mom and Dad to stop fighting. I want them to listen to each other more and not talk bad about each other." Clara's words were simple, but they carried a depth that made everyone present lean forward, attentive. Helena and Ricardo exchanged fleeting glances, each trying to process what their daughter had just said. Clara continued, her eyes flickering between them. Sometimes I feel like I have to decide which of the two I love more, and that makes me feel bad, because I love them both. I don't want to choose. Tears began to well up in Helena's eyes as she tried to keep her composure as she listened. Ricardo ran a hand through his hair, breathing deeply to contain the emotion that was overwhelming him. Helena's lawyer, aware of the emotional impact, stood up to ask a question. Clara, you mentioned that you don't want to choose. What would make you feel more at ease? Clara frowned as if searching for the exact words to express what she felt. Finally, she spoke with a sincerity that could only come from someone her age. I want us to be able to be a family, even if it's different. I don't care if we don't live together anymore, but I want us to be able to be in the same place without fighting. I want us to be able to talk, eat, or laugh like before, even if it's just from time to time. Her answer set off a murmur in the courtroom, which the judge silenced with a bang of his gavel. The simplicity of Clara's wish was both touching and devastating. She wasn't asking for material things or impossible promises, just something her parents seemed to have forgotten: connection. Ricardo's lawyer, moved by Clara's words, stood up carefully. Clara, how do you imagine that moment you just described? The girl smiled slightly as if the thought brought her some comfort. I think of a day when Mom and Dad are together on my birthday, not sitting separately at the tables, but sitting next to each other, talking to me and to each other, without shouting or ignoring each other. Tears were already running down Helena's face, who couldn't help but remember the birthdays Clara had described. Ricardo looked at the ground, his expression full of regret. The judge thanked Clara for her bravery and allowed her to return to her seat. As she did so, the little girl's eyes rested on her parents, searching for something she couldn't put into words. Helena and Ricardo looked at her, and for the first time in a long time, they seemed to be truly connected to what their daughter needed. It wasn't a matter of winning or losing, but of learning to be something better together, even if they were no longer a couple. That moment marked a change in the courtroom. It was not something that could be measured with legal documents, but everyone present knew that Clara's words had touched the hearts of Helena and Ricardo. On the day the judge issued his decision, the courtroom was filled with an air of tense expectation. Clara sat next to her lawyer, silently drawing to distract herself from her nervousness. Her parents, Helena and Ricardo, waited for the verdict with their hands clasped together, not out of affection, but out of a mixture of anxiety and resignation. The judge looked around the room before speaking, making sure his message was clear. After considering the statements of all parties, and in particular Clara's words, this court has reached a decision that prioritizes her emotional well-being and stability. A joint custody agreement will be established, the judge continued. Clara will divide her time between both homes equally. However, this agreement will be conditional on both parents attending family counseling sessions with Clara. The goal of these sessions will be to improve communication between you and ensure that your differences do not interfere with your role as parents. A low murmur ran through the room. The idea of counseling was unusual, but many of those present knew it was for the best under the circumstances. Helena opened her mouth as if to object, but then looked at Clara, who was still absorbed in her drawing, and closed her eyes in acceptance. Ricardo, for his part, merely nodded slowly, aware that the decision was fair and necessary. I hope you both understand what this means, the judge added, looking firmly at Helena and Ricardo. This is not just a legal agreement. It is a commitment to work together so that Clara can grow up in an environment of respect and support. Helena broke the silence first. I accept the conditions, Your Honor. It took Ricardo a little longer, but he finally said, I also accept. Clara looked up from her drawing, noticing the look of relief mixed with uncertainty on her parents' faces. She didn't fully understand what joint custody or family counseling meant, but something in the air told her this was a step towards something better. The judge concluded the session with words that seemed directed more at Helena and Ricardo than at anyone else. Remember that this court can make legal decisions, but what you do with them is up to you. Clara doesn't need perfection. She just needs to know that you're both committed to her happiness and well-being. When the session ended, Helena and Ricardo approached Clara, who was silently putting away her colored pencils. For the first time in a long time, they looked at each other directly, without anger or resentment, only with a shared understanding of the change they needed to undertake. "Clara," said Helena, kneeling in front of her, "we are going to work together to make everything better." Ricardo joined her, leaning toward his daughter. "Yes, daughter, this is not going to be easy, but we want you to know that we are here for you, both of us." Clara looked at them both, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled sincerely. "Thank you, Mom. Thank you, Dad." The road ahead of them wouldn't be easy. There were wounds to heal, patterns to break, and a whole new dynamic to build. But in that moment, the three shared something they hadn't had in a long time: hope. As they walked out of the courtroom together, the cold air hit their faces, but it didn't matter. Helena and Ricardo walked side by side, with Clara between them, holding their small hands as they moved toward a new beginning. These small gestures, however simple, began to make a difference. Clara began to feel less like a visitor in her parents' homes, and more like an essential part of both. Finally, the day Clara had mentioned in court arrived, her birthday. For the first time in years, Helena and Ricardo sat down together to plan it. They decided to hold a small meeting in a park, a neutral place that belonged to neither of them. On her birthday, Clara ran excitedly to a table decorated with balloons and a cake that they had prepared together. For the first time in a long time, her parents were not sitting at opposite ends, but next to each other, sharing laughter and memories with their daughter. As she opened her presents, Clara looked up to see her parents talking to each other. There was no trace of tension, just calm conversation. Her heart filled with something she had longed for deeply. Hope that even if her family could never be the same again, it could be something new, something better. That night, as she went to bed, Clara pulled out a drawing she had made weeks before. It was the same image of three figures holding hands under a blue sky. This time, she added a detail: smiles on all three of their faces. Clara smiled as she turned off the light. She knew the road wouldn't be easy, and there would still be difficult days, but she was sure of one thing: her parents loved her enough to try, and that was enough to start over. Clara's story reminds us that sometimes conflicts between adults can have a profound impact on the most innocent. How far would you be willing to go to protect the well-being of someone you love? Helena and Ricardo learned that it's not about winning or losing, but about finding a common path for the sake of their daughter. What would you have done in their place? Click on the video on screen to continue this powerful reflection on the importance of empathy and teamwork, even in the most difficult times. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories that inspire you to look at life from new perspectives. See you in the next video.